Hey guys, Logan here from Popular Woodworking Magazine. Welcome to our shop. So I've been working in the shop now for give or take 6 months or so, and I'm kind of getting stuff figured out. And what I mean by that is I'm kind of figuring out where I want tools to be. I kind of had an idea when we started building everything where stuff needed to live, and I've started to move things in place, starting to get the new dust collection system set up to get hard piping everywhere. But one of the tools that I have moved into place that's not ever gonna move, and even when we move out of this shop, it's not moving, it's staying here, is this guy. This is a 1955 Crescent Band Saw. It's a 36-inch bandsaw. It's giant, it's super cool, and I wanted to shoot a little bit of a video today on getting this thing set up and running. This was a new old stock bandsaw, and what I mean by that is this bandsaw was manufactured in 1955. And it sat on the pallet that it was shipped on in the Rock Island Armory up until about a year ago when I bought it. So the US government bought 2 of these bandsaws, they installed one, and then they stuck this one in the warehouse kind of as a backup. Now I do have paperwork for it that the government plugged it in like 1977 just to verify that it did work, just kind of as their general audit type thing, but it hasn't ran since. So I figured today, we're gonna get this thing in operating condition. I mean, it's pretty close the way it is. Everything free spins on it, but we have a couple of things we need to do. But before we get into that, I wanna talk a little bit about the size of this bandsaw and why I've kind of started to approach some of these vintage tools as what I want in my shop, and why I don't think it's super crazy to get one of them for you. So this is a 36-inch bandsaw, as I said. Now, if you're gonna go out and buy a new 36-inch bandsaw, I can't even imagine what the cost would be. I have to guess that it would be over $20,000. I bought this bandsaw for 2,000 bucks. That was what I paid for the bandsaw, plus I had fuel to drive 4 hours to get it each way, and a trailer rental. I rented a hydraulic drop bed trailer so that the gentleman that helped me load it had a forklift. We could just plop it in there, and then when I got it here to the shop, I was just able to use the pallet jack and tractor and kind of slide it out of the trailer into the shop. Then getting off the pallet is a whole different story. It involved a gantry crane and taking the top wheel off and stuff and getting it in place. But for that investment, let's call it maybe 2,500 bucks after fuel and everything. This is a whole lot of bandsaw for that money. Now, there is some things you have to think about. Well, mainly the electrical, and we'll talk about that once we get there. But let's go ahead and take a look at some of the details on the saw first. So when looking at any form of tool, I'm going to talk about this bandsaw in particular, there's a couple things I look at. The first, with it being a vintage tool, I want to look at the bearings. There's basically 2 options for bearings. Either they're going to be ball bearings, which are the modern bearings that most of our tools today have, or they're going to be what are called Babbitt bearings. And Babbitt bearings kind of get a bad rap. Babbitt bearings are a tin and lead based filler around a shaft, and it requires an oil bath to kind of keep it lubricated. And they do wear out over time, and that's why it gets a bad rap. But in reality, a good Babbitt bearing actually is going to run extremely smooth, and it's going to last quite a while. This bandsaw in particular, has ball bearings. The top one is actually an oil bath ball bearing, so it does require some oil. We'll add that in a little bit. But that's the first thing I look at. Second is general overall condition. Now, because this is what I consider a new old stock, functionally nothing's wrong with this bandsaw. There's a few minor cosmetic things, but I'm not terribly concerned about those. You know, looking here at, let's look at the guides, for example. You know, this guide still has the sticker on it from Carter in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It spins nice and easily. The cool blocks are in great shape because they've never been used. There's maybe a little surface rust on some of these zinc parts, and we'll clean those off maybe. It doesn't really matter. But then everything else is free moving. There is, on some of these parts, when I picked up this saw, I've already cleaned off this table for the most part, but this table and all the bare metal parts were covered in Cosmoline film. Cosmoline is a liquid spray-on or brushed-on coating that is a rust preventative. It's very sticky. It's kind of a pain in the butt to clean off, but that's like what some of this stuff here is still. That's still a little bit of Cosmoline on some of these bare metal parts. Generally, you're not going to find that on a tool, but you do want to inspect most of these critical parts, especially on a vintage piece of machinery, because odds are it's going to be hard to find parts like this. So a couple of other things that I'm going to look at in particular on this bandsaw. We have some cool accessories. There's a gooseneck light here, and it's super cool, kind of funky. The problem I have with it is it doesn't really stay anywhere I put it, and I don't know if that's just fatigue because it's been hanging out here for 70 years. So I'm probably at this point going to pull this off sometime today, and then I will figure out a way to stiffen this up. I think a piece of aluminum rod through this is generally how these are stiffened, so when you position it, it'll stay where you put it. We'll deal with that in a bit. The overall paint condition on this saw is pretty good. The wheel covers here are pretty clean. Again, the saw was never used. There are some areas that are flaking because this was in a heated and cooled warehouse. There was temperature fluctuations before heat and cooling would get turned on. So some of the paint has started to flake. Now, we'll test this for lead in a little bit because I'm guessing more than likely 1955, 70 years ago, it's probably a lead-based paint, but we'll verify it and we'll take the precautions that we need for that. Some of the other accessories that I'm going to take a look at on a bandsaw in particular are the fence. This one, when I picked up the saw, it was on the pallet and it had a box next to it, and I assumed that this fence was in there, and it is. So the fence has this rail and the moving fence here. This is a right-hand fence, so that's different than most modern saws today. Most modern bandsaws, the fence is going to be on the left-hand side of the blade. This is on the right-hand side, which I actually really like, and I think I'm going to like using it because as I'm working at a bandsaw, my left hand, which is my off hand, and my dominant hand, my right hand, is pushing. So left hand's going to keep the workpiece up against the fence. The right hand's going to apply most of the pressure, feeding it through the blade. So I think I'm going to like this setup. So let's pop these covers open and take a look at the wheels because that's where the rubber meets the blade, pun intended. Okay, so opening up the saw, you can kind of get a scale for how big the saw actually is. And there are some things in here that, from a bandsaw standpoint, I'm looking at. First, I want to make sure some of these older bandsaws have wooden wheels on them. Those are going to be older than this 1955, but I don't personally really want to mess with wooden wheels. So these are obviously steel spoked wheels. There's a couple of things I'm looking at in here. First, I want to see if these bearings are seized up. Again, this one hasn't been used, so they're not. You can see really here, you can see that cosmoline, that kind of oily looking film on those, on that hub there. And then I'm also looking at the tires themselves. Now, these tires, as you can kind of see right up here, they have stretched and sagged and dry rotted over the years. So I knew that we were going to have to replace those. I have a set here that we will install in a bit. So that's something I'm keeping an eye on because that is a couple $100 to get new tires for a saw this size. Now, moving down to the bottom wheel here, we have a little bit different look than up here. Up here is just a nut and a hub, but down here, we have kind of a different system. It is still a hub, but instead of having a nut on the outside, this one actually has a keyway and a set screw. And there actually might even be a second set screw. It looks like there is here. So we have a couple set screws that attach this hub to the shaft. Now, this is a direct drive bandsaw. We'll step around the backside in a minute and look at the motor because the motor is pretty impressive. It's huge, even though it's only like a 2 or 3 horse motor, it's huge. But this is direct driven. So unlike most modern bandsaws that are going to have the motor mounted with pulleys and belts attached to the wheel, this is actually the motor shaft here. So it's kind of an interesting setup, and this is the way a lot of these bigger industrial saws are set up. Now, there's another thing to note. There's actually a couple things to note down here, too. First is we have a grease zerk back here. So this is an area for putting grease into what I assume is a ball bearing system inside the motor. So this, It spins really, really nice for being 70 years old. But I think before we get this up to full speed, we'll go ahead and add a little bit of grease just to kind of freshen it up, because I'm guessing that grease is pretty goopy after a while. Now, the other thing that I mentioned is I'm starting to get the dust collection piping set up. This saw doesn't necessarily have great dust collection as it sits. What we have over here is we have the lower bearing unit, and then we have this wooden plate in here that's kind of screwed in with a couple of bolts. I'll probably make a new one of these and kind of tighten everything up a bit. And there's a small little discharge port right here on the side. So I'm going to have to come up with some form of dust collection fitting for that. I don't know what that's going to look like yet, and I might lean into the folk over at Oneida for that, because I know there's a few people on their staff that really like to retrofit dust collection to older tools, but that's going to be a problem for a different day. So now I'm going to go ahead and close this up. Let's step around the back side, because I want to take a look at that motor, and I want to show you the mechanism to tilt this table, because that is also pretty impressive. All right, so on the back side of the saw, we have a handful of different things that I'm not looking at them. I mean, it's here already, but there's a couple of different adjustments. So we have here underneath the neck, this is going to be the blade tension. So this is how I'm going to spread the two wheels apart and tension one of these blades, which are 22.5 feet long or something ridiculous like that. Then we also have this T-handle here. This is what's going to control the blade tracking. So by adjusting this, it's going to tilt this entire top shaft up or down to adjust where that blade is riding on those tires. We'll have to talk about all of that once we get those wheels on, and et cetera, et cetera. And I have the tail for that light here. I disconnected it when I brought this into the shop. I had to remove the entire top wheel and the top guard to get it through the doorway. And I just never reconnected it because I knew that we're going to be doing some stuff with the power. So we'll take that off in a little bit. One thing I do want to point out while we're back here, and this is what, in my mind, makes vintage machinery much different than what we can buy today. Now, we can still buy some good machinery. There's a lot of good machinery manufacturers out there. I'm not speaking ill of them. But not many have this sort of gib system. Now, what this is there is a dovetailed way up here that this top wheel rides on. And that dovetailed way has a mating set that is attached to this top wheel bracket. And there are these 3 gib screws. And these screws have lock nuts on them, and you can back those lock nuts off, and you can tighten these bolts. And that actually is going to press a brass or bronze plate up tight against that gib. That's designed so that over the years, as you're using the saw, theoretically in an industrial setting where you're adjusting it all of the time, you can compensate for wear. So that's a super cool feature, and one of the reasons that I really like these vintage machines. They were designed really to last, so that's pretty awesome. Now on the backside, you can also see this mechanism here. This is a spring-loaded chain mechanism to help raise and lower this blade guide. So this guy is actually spring-loaded. It's just a little bit of an assist. I think once I get the rest of that Cosmoline cleaned off of the shaft, this thing's going to work really, really nicely. Now, there's a couple other really cool things back here before we get down to this giant motor. We have some of the original nameplates here. So this is the Crescent Woodworking Machinery Company. It's built by the Enterprise Company in Columbia, Ohio. So made in America, which is super awesome. This one in particular is serial number C496. If you go to vintagemachinery.org, I can actually log this saw in their catalog, so I can see who has the saw right before and right after mine, as long as they've cataloged that serial number. And here we have a plant equipment. It says there's an accounting number, just another identification badge, but the really cool ones are back here. Now this saw was originally distributed by the Henry Walk Company out of Norfolk, Virginia. So their original tag is still back here. And then back here, we have the U.S. government ID tag. So anytime the U.S. government buys a piece of equipment, especially a large piece of equipment, they put an ID tag on it. It says U.S. government property, not anymore. And it says do not remove, and there's an ID number. So that's all pretty cool. Now let's go ahead and jump down to this table tilt mechanism and the motor. So down here, you can see the size of this motor. Now this is the original motor that was on it. And this is a 3-phase motor. And I know that's a lot of people's real big problems with these pieces of equipment is that they don't have 3-phase power available. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to get 3-phase power, or to fake the motor into thinking you have 3-phase power, because I don't have 3-phase power in this shop. But we'll talk about that in a bit. So this is the big old direct drive motor. There is a hoist on it. If you ever need to remove the motor, you would definitely want a hoist to do that. I've already popped off the electronic cover over here on the side because I know we're gonna have to do a little bit of wiring, maybe in a different video, but that's the motor. Now the other really cool thing back here is this tilt mechanism for the table. Now let me slide these blades out of the way and show you how this works. So we have this gear, this little worm gear here with the set of cogs. Now everything's still covered in cosmoline, so it looks really oily, but it's just kind of sticky, like maple syrup. And then there's this cute little brass pointer here that points at our angles. And as you adjust this, this entire table starts tilting. So we can actually tilt this table on this bandsaw clear up to 45 degrees, which is super cool. And this, I think, is another reason why that is a right-hand fence on the bandsaw, because then your workpiece is laying into the fence and it's supported by that. Now, when you would ever need to lay this table to 45 degrees and make a cut on something this big, I don't know, but we'll see if we ever use it. But it is a really cool mechanism. I'll have to clean this up, get rid of some of this cosmoline buildup on here. And then we do have a couple adjustable stops to set our 90-degree position on the table. So let's go ahead and step around the front and see where we need to get started and get this thing back into fighting shape. All right, so this video is getting a little bit longer than I expected. I kind of wanted to give you guys a lay of the land with this bandsaw. So I think I'm going to split the kind of restoration and getting this thing back up and running into a second video. So make sure you check that out. But now I'm going to get some gloves on and I'm going to start doing that right away because I can't wait to get this thing running. So take a look for the second video, which will be getting this thing up and running. We'll talk about getting new tires on, the variable frequency drive, which is how we power a 3-phase piece of equipment in a standard shop, and standing back behind plexiglass when we turn it on for the first time because it's going to be scary. So we'll see you guys next time.